Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax.
The house-sitting nightmare. I was 22 years old when this incident completely changed how I view the world around me. Fresh out of university with my degree still gathering dust on my childhood bedroom wall, I found myself in that strange limbo between student life and real adulthood, taking whatever work came my way to keep money flowing while I searched for something more permanent. My days consisted of watching neighbors' children after school, scrubbing kitchens until they gleamed, driving elderly residents to their appointments, basically anything that would put cash in my pocket without requiring a long-term commitment. That's how I met Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman whose poodles I'd watched several times before, and she must have thought highly of me because she recommended my services to someone she knew through her neighborhood book club, a gentleman named Marcus. When Marcus called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice sounded pleasant enough over the phone, explaining that he needed someone reliable to stay at his home for a full week while he traveled for business, taking care of his golden retriever named Duke, who apparently suffered from separation anxiety and needed overnight companionship rather than just quick check-ins. The compensation he offered exceeded my usual rates by a considerable margin, which should have been my first warning sign, but when you're struggling financially, you tend to overlook red flags in favor of green bills. Our initial meeting happened 2 days before he was scheduled to leave, and Marcus appeared exactly as I'd pictured him from our phone conversation, somewhere in his late 40s with thin-framed glasses perched on his nose and a navy jacket that looked like it had seen better days. Nothing about his demeanor struck me as particularly concerning during that first encounter. Perhaps he seemed overly eager to make conversation and his friendliness felt slightly forced, but I attributed that to him being nervous about leaving his beloved pet with a stranger. His residence sat on the outskirts of our small town, nestled among thick trees that blocked most of the neighboring houses from view, and while the property itself appeared well maintained, the interior decoration suggested time had stopped somewhere around 1995 with its beige wall-to-wall carpeting and curtains covered in faded flower patterns. Marcus guided me through each room methodically, explaining Duke's feeding schedule, showing me where he kept the emergency house key, pointing out which items in the refrigerator I was welcome to consume during my stay. The guest bedroom he'd prepared for me was located just off the main living area on the ground floor, furnished simply with a double bed, an old wooden dresser, and mismatched nightstands that looked like garage sale finds. Everything seemed straightforward enough, and I left that day feeling confident about the upcoming week. Monday arrived with clear skies and I settled into the house without any issues, finding Duke to be a sweet-natured dog who seemed happy to have company. The first evening passed peacefully as I watched television while Duke dozed at my feet, and later we took a leisurely walk around the property before retiring to the guest room where he curled up contentedly at the foot of the bed. Tuesday followed the same comfortable routine, and I began to relax into the quiet rhythm of the house, appreciating the break from my usual hectic schedule of juggling multiple small jobs throughout the day. But Wednesday night brought a change that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I was sitting cross-legged on the bed, mindlessly scrolling through social media on my phone when something about the dresser across from me caught my attention. Positioned next to a small ceramic lamp sat a digital alarm clock that seemed oddly out of place among the room's dated furnishings, its sleek black plastic casing and bright blue numbers belonging to a much more recent era than everything else surrounding it. Something compelled me to examine it more closely. Perhaps it was the way the lamplight reflected off its surface, or just an instinct that something wasn't quite right about its placement. As I leaned forward to get a better look, my blood turned to ice when I spotted a tiny, perfectly circular opening just above the digital display, and the more I stared at it, the more certain I became that this wasn't any ordinary clock feature. My hands trembled as I picked up the device, immediately noticing its unexpected weight and the subtle humming vibration emanating from within like a miniature cooling system was running inside. When I turned the clock to face me directly and peered into that small dark opening, the horrible reality crashed over me in waves of nausea and fear because I knew without a doubt that I was looking directly into a camera lens that had been recording everything happening in this bed. Duke suddenly raised his head from his resting spot near the door and began making distressed whining sounds, his ears perked and alert as if sensing danger approaching. Then I heard it too, the unmistakable sound of a door closing somewhere deeper inside the house. Not the main entrance but an interior door that shouldn't have been moving at all. Every nerve in my body screamed danger as I stood frozen with the camera clock still clutched in my shaking hands, my heart hammering so violently I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Marcus wasn't supposed to return until Sunday afternoon, yet here we were on Wednesday night and someone was definitely moving through the house with slow, deliberate footsteps on the carpeted hallway. I managed to set the clock back on the dresser and rushed to the bedroom door, turning the lock just as the footsteps came to a stop directly outside. Marcus's voice drifted through the door, unnaturally calm but slightly breathless as if he'd been hurrying, claiming he'd forgotten something important in the guest room during his last visit home and asking me to please unlock the door so he could retrieve it. My throat constricted with fear and I found myself unable to form words or even breathe properly as I pressed my back against the door. After a moment of silence, he spoke again, insisting that the device wasn't what I was thinking, that it was merely a motion detector he used to monitor Duke's nighttime movements and he hadn't mentioned it because he didn't want to make me uncomfortable. I took several steps backward, my hand pressed over my mouth to stifle any sound that might escape, while he continued talking through the door. His tone shifted to something more assertive as he insisted we could discuss this like rational adults if I would just open the door and let him explain properly, but when I remained silent, his knocking transformed into aggressive pounding that made the door frame shake. The calm facade completely disappeared as he shouted at me to open the door immediately, his voice now sharp with barely controlled rage while Duke barked frantically and jumped at the door from my side. I looked desperately at the window which sat low enough to escape through, but the lock was painted shut from years of neglect. My fingers fumbled with the window latch, shaking so badly that I failed twice before finally managing to force it open on the third attempt. Behind me, Marcus was now threatening to use his spare key to enter the room and call the police, claiming I was trespassing in his home and had broken in without permission. Without waiting to hear more of his threats, I pushed the window open as wide as it would go and climbed through awkwardly, dropping onto the damp grass outside with a painful thud. Duke tried to follow, his paws scrabbling at the windowsill, but he ultimately stayed inside as I ran through the darkness of the side yard and down the long gravel driveway. My phone was mercifully still in my pocket and I called my mother while running, breathlessly begging her to come get me immediately without explaining why. By the time her car appeared, I had hidden myself behind a row of mailboxes at the main road, far enough from the house that I couldn't see it but still checking over my shoulder every few seconds. I spent that night at my mother's house, unable to sleep as I replayed every moment in my mind. The next morning, I blocked Marcus's number on my phone and contacted a lawyer my mother knew, hoping there might be some legal recourse for what had happened to me. The attorney listened to my story with sympathy but delivered disappointing news, explaining that without physical evidence like the actual camera or recordings from it, pursuing charges would be nearly impossible since Marcus could easily claim the device was an innocent motion sensor and I had misunderstood its purpose. She strongly advised against returning to retrieve evidence, and honestly, the thought of ever seeing Marcus again made me physically ill. I never received payment for the 3 nights I stayed there, and the woman who had recommended me, Mrs. Henderson, stopped returning my calls and messages, leaving me to wonder if she knew something about Marcus that she hadn't warned me about. For months afterward, I suffered from nightmares about opening my eyes to find camera lenses watching me from every corner of my room. Even now, I compulsively check every clock, smoke detector, and picture frame in any space where I'm staying, and I can't shake the memory of that moment when I stared into that tiny lens, or the sound of that door closing somewhere in what I believed was an empty house, which makes me think he might have been there the entire time, watching me through that camera from some hidden room. The vacation rental terror. My girlfriend Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months, a long weekend to visit her sister who'd recently moved to a small mountain town about 3 hours from where we lived in the city. I found the rental property in early September while browsing through vacation rental websites, drawn to it because the price was reasonable, the location was convenient to her sister's apartment, and the reviews seemed genuinely positive with multiple guests praising the quaint charm of the place. The listing photos showed a beautiful old farmhouse with a wide wooden porch that wrapped around 2 sides, warm golden light streaming through the living room windows, original hardwood floors that had been polished to a rich shine, and the whole property had this cozy, storybook quality that seemed perfect for our romantic getaway. There was one small notation in the property description mentioning that the basement storage area was not accessible to guests. but this seemed completely reasonable since many hosts keep their personal belongings locked away during rentals. When we finally arrived at the property just as the sun was beginning to set on that first evening, the reality was somewhat different from the carefully staged photos we'd seen online. The house still had charm but showed more wear than expected, with paint peeling in places and a general sense of age that the photos had cleverly hidden, and its isolated location became immediately apparent with only one other structure visible in the distance and dense forest pressing in from all sides along the narrow access road. The owner, a man named Gerald, was already standing on the porch when we pulled into the gravel driveway, as if he'd been watching for our arrival from inside the house. He appeared to be in his late 50s with carefully combed gray hair that looked like he'd just stepped out of a barber shop, wearing a crisp plaid shirt tucked precisely into his jeans with a leather belt that looked freshly polished. His smile when he greeted us was technically friendly, but there was something mechanical about it, reminding me of those forced grins you see in corporate headshots where someone's been told to look approachable but doesn't quite know how to make it genuine. When we shook hands, his grip was firm but he held on just a second too long, and his eyes had this intense quality that made me feel like he was memorizing every detail about us. He led us through the front entrance into a narrow hallway that carried a strange mixture of scents, like old dust mixed with something artificially sweet, possibly air freshener trying to mask something else underneath. The living room contained large, worn furniture that had probably been there since the 80s, facing an ancient television set that still had dials instead of buttons, and the kitchen, while clean, featured appliances that belonged in a vintage museum. Upstairs, the single bedroom was spacious enough with a king-sized bed positioned under a slowly rotating ceiling fan and a small antique dresser with an attached mirror that had started to develop those dark spots old mirrors get. When we returned downstairs, Gerald paused at a door near the kitchen and I noticed the heavy industrial padlock hanging from a thick metal latch that had been installed much more recently than anything else in the house. His entire demeanor changed when he addressed that door, his voice dropping to a more serious tone as he stated firmly that this door remained locked at all times, that it contained his personal storage, and we had absolutely no reason to go near it during our stay. The friendly mask he'd been wearing slipped completely during this warning, and he stared at us for an uncomfortable moment before returning to his tour guide persona to show us where extra towels were stored. After Gerald finally left, Sarah and I unpacked our belongings and made ourselves comfortable, brewing some tea and sitting on the porch for a while trying to enjoy the peaceful evening sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. But when we eventually went to bed, the complete silence of the rural location felt oppressive rather than peaceful, with no distant traffic sounds or human voices to remind us we weren't completely alone in the wilderness. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, I was pulled from sleep by what sounded like a heavy thud from somewhere beneath our bedroom floor. I lay still, straining to hear if the sound would repeat, but after several minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been the old house settling or perhaps an animal under the porch. The next morning we drove into town for breakfast at a small diner, spent the day exploring antique shops and local attractions, and met Sarah's sister for a long lunch at her favorite restaurant. We stayed out until after dark, returning to find the house exactly as we'd left it, and settled in to make dinner and watch a movie on our laptop since the old television barely functioned. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, I woke needing to use the bathroom, and as I made my way back toward the bedroom, I froze halfway up the stairs when I heard an unmistakable dragging sound coming from below, like someone pulling something heavy across a concrete floor. The sound continued for about 5 seconds, stopped completely, then started again with the same rhythm and duration. My first thought was that Gerald had returned to retrieve something from his storage area, but he had explicitly told us he wouldn't be anywhere near the property during our rental period. I stood perfectly still on those stairs, barely breathing, until the sound finally stopped for good, then crept back to the bedroom where I found Sarah sitting up in bed with wide eyes. She whispered that she was awake and had heard everything too, and we lay there for another hour without speaking, just listening for any other sounds from below, but the house remained silent except for our own rapid breathing. Neither of us slept well for the remainder of that night. The second night brought new and more disturbing sounds from the basement. We had spent another full day out with Sarah's sister, trying to enjoy ourselves, but as evening approached, we both felt a growing dread about returning to the house. Sure enough, around 2:45 in the morning, the noises began again, but this time instead of dragging sounds, we heard distinct footsteps on what sounded like concrete or stone. The pattern was deliberate and strange, maybe 4 or 5 steps in one direction, then a long pause as if whoever was down there was stopping to listen, then 3 more steps in what might have been a different direction. During the pauses between footsteps, Sarah grabbed my arm and whispered that she swore she could hear breathing, heavy and labored like someone struggling with physical exertion. My heart was racing, but I was too terrified to get out of bed and risk making noise that might attract attention to our presence upstairs. We remained frozen under the covers, eyes wide open staring at nothing, until the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows. By the third morning, the entire atmosphere of the house had shifted into something actively hostile and oppressive. We still went through the motions of tourist activities during the day, but neither of us could shake the feeling of dread that intensified every time we thought about returning to that house. During the afternoon, while Sarah was in the shower, I decided to examine the basement door more closely in the daylight. The padlock remained firmly in place, but when I leaned close to the door frame, I detected a distinct odor seeping through the gaps, something stale and damp mixed with an underlying sourness that made my stomach turn, like something organic had been left to decay in a humid environment. That night, the sounds began much earlier, starting around midnight with a metallic clinking noise, like someone tapping a piece of metal against concrete or pipes. This was followed by the now familiar footsteps, but they seemed more agitated, moving faster and lasting for nearly an hour with only brief pauses between episodes. Sarah barely spoke to me as we prepared for bed on the 4th night, both of us exhausted from lack of sleep and constant anxiety. While she was brushing her hair at the dresser, she suddenly stopped and asked me to look at the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling directly above our bed because something about it seemed wrong. At first glance, I didn't notice anything unusual, but when I stood on the bed to examine it more closely, I saw what had caught her attention: a small, perfectly round black dot in the center of the white plastic that had a different shine than the surrounding material, almost like a tiny piece of glass or polished metal. A sick feeling washed over me as I grabbed a chair to reach the detector properly and unscrewed it from its mount. Inside, nestled among the regular components, was a small camera with a tiny green LED indicating it was actively recording, positioned to capture everything that happened in the bed below. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn, while I searched the rest of the room with growing horror and discovered another tiny lens barely visible through a small hole that had been drilled in the wall near the dresser mirror, also aimed directly at the bed from a different angle. We didn't speak as we threw our belongings into our bags without any attempt at organization, leaving the house immediately and driving to the nearest 24-hour gas station where we could safely call the police. 2 officers met us there within 30 minutes and listened to our complete account of everything that had occurred during our stay. We explained about the strange noises from the basement each night, the cameras hidden in the bedroom, the owner's aggressive warning about the locked basement door, and our growing fear that something deeply wrong was happening in that house. The officers followed us back to the property, where technically we still had legal access since we had paid for 4 nights. The front door remained unlocked as we had left it in our haste to escape, and the police entered with us, immediately locating and documenting the cameras we had discovered. They also found additional recording equipment hidden in other areas of the house that we hadn't even thought to check. When we showed them the basement door, we were shocked to discover it now stood wide open, though the stairway beyond was completely dark and seemed to swallow the beam of their flashlights. We explained that this door had been locked throughout our stay and that Gerald had been very specific about not allowing us access to this area. The officers descended the stairs while we waited in the kitchen, and within moments we heard raised voices and what sounded like a scuffle from below. There was shouting and the sound of furniture being knocked over, and it became clear they had found something or someone down there. One of the officers called us to the top of the stairs and asked us to confirm if someone they had detained was the property owner. To our complete horror and disgust, it was indeed Gerald, who had apparently been hiding in a closet in the basement that contained monitoring equipment connected to the cameras upstairs. The police arrested Gerald immediately and he was charged with criminal trespass, voyeurism, and invasion of privacy. We provided our statements to the prosecutors but thankfully didn't have to appear in court as the evidence was overwhelming and he eventually took a plea deal. The vacation rental company offered us a substantial credit toward future bookings, clearly hoping to minimize negative publicity about the incident, and while we accepted their offer, it hasn't stopped us from sharing our experience with anyone who will listen. The psychological impact on both Sarah and myself has been significant and lasting, destroying our ability to trust any rental properties, and now we exclusively stay in established hotels where there's at least some corporate oversight and accountability. The roommate's secret. My name is Thomas, and this nightmare began just over a week ago, though looking back now, the warning signs had been accumulating for months. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the downtown area with my roommate David, someone I'd never met before we signed the lease together after connecting through an online housing forum where people search for shared living situations. When we first met in person to tour the apartment, David seemed like exactly the kind of roommate I was hoping to find, quiet and reserved but polite, maybe a bit socially awkward but not in any way that raised red flags, just someone who seemed like he'd keep to himself and pay his share of the bills on time. I wasn't looking to make a new best friend, just needed someone reliable to split the increasingly expensive rent in this city, and David appeared to fit that requirement perfectly. The first few months of our arrangement passed without any notable incidents. Our work schedules were completely opposite, with me working a standard Monday through Friday office job while David worked overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse on the other side of town. This meant our paths rarely crossed, and when they did, it was usually just a brief encounter in the kitchen or a quick greeting in the hallway. Most mornings when I left for work, his bedroom door would be closed with no sound coming from within, and in the evenings when I returned home, he'd already left for his shift. Maybe once or twice a week we'd actually have a real interaction, usually just small talk about bills or apartment maintenance, nothing deep or personal, which suited both of us perfectly fine. But then I started noticing small things in my bedroom that felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why they bothered me so much. The first incident happened when I came home later than usual after drinks with coworkers and found my closet door standing open when I distinctly remembered closing it that morning because I don't like looking at the mess of clothes inside. A few days later, I noticed my desk chair had been turned to face the bed instead of the desk where I always leave it, and while these seemed like minor things I could have done absent-mindedly, something in my gut told me these changes weren't my doing. There was this persistent feeling, like an itch I couldn't scratch, that someone had been in my private space without permission. Last Saturday morning, I decided to do a thorough cleaning of my room, dusting all the surfaces and wiping down the windows to let in more light. As I was cleaning the upper corner where the wall met the ceiling, I discovered something that made my blood run cold and confirmed all my paranoid suspicions. There was a tiny black device, no bigger than a button, stuck to the wall with what looked like double-sided tape. At first, I thought it might be some kind of pest control device or maybe a smoke detector component, but when I looked closer, I could see the unmistakable gleam of a small camera lens pointed directly at my bed. My hands shook as I pulled it off the wall, feeling its weight and the smooth plastic casing that clearly wasn't some innocent household device. It had a slot for a memory card, though the card itself was missing, which meant someone had been regularly retrieving the footage it captured. The only person with access to my room besides me was David, and he wasn't home at that moment, his door closed as usual with the apartment silent except for my own rapid breathing. I stood in the hallway staring at his door, every instinct screaming at me not to violate his privacy the way he had violated mine, but I had to know what else might be hidden in that room. I turned the handle slowly and pushed open his door to reveal a room that smelled of unwashed clothes and stale food, with the blinds drawn so tightly that no natural light could enter even though it was the middle of a sunny day. His bed was a tangle of sheets and blankets, and his desk was buried under piles of papers, unopened mail, and random objects that seemed to have no organizational system. I searched carefully through his belongings, half expecting to find more cameras or perhaps computer files with recordings, but found nothing obviously incriminating, just the mess of someone who didn't care much about cleanliness or organization. I closed his door and returned to my room, but the feeling of violation wouldn't leave me alone. I decided to set a trap to confirm my suspicions beyond any doubt. I placed the camera in my nightstand drawer, buried under some socks and other items, reasoning that if David came looking for it, I would have my proof that he was responsible for planting it in the first place. For 2 nights, nothing happened, and I began to wonder if I was being paranoid, if maybe the camera had been left by a previous tenant or had some other explanation I hadn't considered. But on the 3rd night, everything became horrifyingly clear. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a soft sliding sound, like wood moving against wood, and realized with growing horror that it was coming from my nightstand drawer being carefully opened. Through barely opened eyes, I could see a figure in the darkness beside my bed, and even in the dim light filtering through my blinds, I recognized David's silhouette as he searched through the drawer where I'd hidden the camera. My heart pounded so hard I was certain he must be able to hear it, but I forced myself to remain still, pretending to still be asleep while watching him through my eyelashes. He continued searching for several seconds before suddenly freezing in place, his hands still in the drawer but his body completely motionless. Slowly, with deliberate movement that made my skin crawl, he turned his head to look directly at me, and even in the darkness I could feel his eyes boring into mine. Then he spoke in a calm, quiet voice that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting, telling me he knew I was awake and there was no point in pretending otherwise. The fear that had paralyzed me suddenly transformed into anger, and I sat up quickly, demanding to know why he had put a camera in my room, my voice shaking with a combination of rage and terror. He straightened up and stared at me with an expression I couldn't read in the darkness, then claimed he'd installed it because he suspected I'd been stealing from him. I told him that was complete nonsense and he knew it, pointing out that the camera had been aimed at my bed, not at any place where I might hide stolen goods, and that what he'd done was sick and criminal. He kept insisting he just needed proof of my theft, but his explanation made no sense and we both knew he was lying. We began shouting at each other, him insisting I was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding while I threatened to report him to both our landlord and the police. My voice cracked with emotion as I told him this was one of the most violating things anyone had ever done to me. Finally, I yanked open the drawer, grabbed the camera, and held it up between us like evidence in a trial, telling him this was proof of his sick behavior and he would never get it back. I stormed out of my bedroom and into the kitchen where I threw the camera into the garbage can with enough force that I heard the plastic crack. I told him to stay away from my room and that I would be reporting everything to the landlord first thing in the morning. David stood in the hallway with his fists clenched at his sides, staring at me with an expression that was completely blank, devoid of any emotion I could identify, before turning and walking back to his room without saying another word. I couldn't go back to sleep that night, instead sitting on the couch with the television on for company, jumping at every small sound in the apartment and wondering if he might try to enter my room again. When the sun finally rose and I felt safe enough to move, I checked the garbage can only to discover the camera had vanished. That was a week ago, and while I reported everything to the landlord, he simply said he would look into it, but so far has taken no action whatsoever. David still lives here, we still share this space, but now we don't speak at all, and the way he looks at me when we pass in the hallway makes my skin crawl with revulsion and fear. It's like he's waiting for something, watching for me to make some move or mistake, and I have no idea what his real motivation was for recording me or what he planned to do with that footage. His excuse about theft was so obviously fabricated that it insulted my intelligence, but the truth might be even worse than what I've imagined. Every night when I try to sleep, I can't escape the feeling that there might be more cameras hidden in places I haven't thought to look, perhaps inside the electrical outlets or behind the air vents or in any number of clever hiding spots. I've searched my room dozens of times but found nothing else, yet the paranoia persists and grows stronger each day. Last night, I was lying awake around 2 in the morning when I heard footsteps approach my door and stop just outside. For over a minute, there was complete silence except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as he shifted his weight from foot to foot, just standing there in the darkness outside my room like some kind of stalker. He stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes before I finally heard his footsteps retreat back down the hallway to his own room. I'm actively looking for a new place to live, but the rental market is brutal right now and finding something I can afford on my own seems nearly impossible. I've also been researching whether I can press charges for invasion of privacy or voyeurism, but without concrete evidence like photos of the camera or recorded admissions of guilt, my lawyer friend says it would be my word against his. I didn't think to take pictures when I found the camera, didn't record our confrontation, and don't have any text messages where he admits to anything. I essentially have nothing except my own testimony and the constant fear that comes from living with someone who violated my privacy in such a fundamental way and continues to share my living space as if nothing happened. I don't know how this situation will resolve itself, but I need to get out of here before something worse happens, because the way he watches me now tells me this isn't over. The hotel room discovery. My husband Michael and I had been planning our anniversary trip to Chicago for nearly 6 months, saving every extra penny to afford 3 nights at what appeared to be a charming boutique hotel in the heart of the city that had stellar reviews and beautiful photos showcasing vintage elegance with modern comfort. We arrived on a Thursday evening after driving 5 hours from our small town in Indiana, both exhausted but excited to finally have some time away from our demanding jobs and the constant stress of daily life. The hotel lobby was everything the photos had promised, with gleaming marble floors, Art Deco fixtures that looked like they'd been carefully preserved from the 1920s, and a grand staircase that curved elegantly up to the guest floors. The desk clerk, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a professional smile, checked us in efficiently and handed us an actual brass key attached to a heavy wooden tag, explaining that the hotel prided itself on maintaining certain classic touches that modern chain hotels had abandoned. Our room was on the 3rd floor, and when we opened the heavy wooden door, we were initially delighted by the spacious layout with high ceilings, crown molding painted in gold leaf, and a massive 4-poster bed that looked like something from a period drama. The bathroom featured a clawfoot tub and subway tiles that had been restored to pristine white, and the whole space felt like stepping back in time to an era of luxury and sophistication. We unpacked our clothes into the antique wardrobe since the room deliberately had no modern closets, maintaining its historical authenticity, and I was arranging my toiletries in the bathroom when I noticed something odd about the ornate mirror hanging above the sink. The glass seemed perfect at first glance, but when the light hit it at a certain angle, there was a small spot near the top corner that didn't reflect quite right, almost like there was something behind the glass that created a different texture. I mentioned it to Michael, but he was already stretched out on the bed, exhausted from the drive, and told me I was being paranoid because I'd been watching too many true crime documentaries lately. But something about that spot bothered me enough that I grabbed a chair from the writing desk and climbed up to examine it more closely, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the corner of the mirror. What I discovered made my stomach turn to ice because there, barely visible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, was a tiny lens positioned behind what must have been two-way glass, angled perfectly to capture anyone using the bathroom. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone, and when I called Michael over to look, his face went from skeptical to furious in the span of seconds. We immediately began searching the rest of the room with the paranoid thoroughness of people who just had their trust completely shattered, and what we found was absolutely horrifying. There was another camera hidden inside what looked like a vintage heating grate near the bed, positioned to record the entire sleeping area, and a third one concealed in a decorative light fixture that hung directly over the armchair where someone might get dressed. Michael wanted to storm down to the front desk immediately and raise hell, but I convinced him we needed to document everything first, so we spent the next 30 minutes taking photos and videos of each camera location, making sure to capture multiple angles and close-ups that clearly showed the lenses. Only after we had our evidence secured did we pack our belongings and head down to confront the management. The night manager, an older man with thinning hair and an expensive-looking suit, initially tried to dismiss our concerns, suggesting we might be mistaking standard security equipment for something sinister. But when we showed him the photos on our phones, his demeanor changed instantly, his face going pale as he realized the magnitude of what we'd discovered and the potential lawsuit his hotel was facing. He immediately offered to move us to a different room and comp our entire stay, but we were already calling the police from the lobby, refusing to spend another minute in that establishment. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes and we led them back to the room, showing them each camera we'd found and explaining how they were positioned to capture guests in their most private moments. The investigation that followed revealed something even more disturbing than we'd initially imagined. The cameras weren't connected to any official hotel security system but were instead streaming to a private server that the police traced to a room in the basement that wasn't supposed to exist according to the building's official floor plans. In that hidden room, investigators found recording equipment, multiple hard drives containing what they described as extensive footage, and evidence that someone had been selling access to these streams on the dark web. The FBI got involved at that point, and we were told the investigation had expanded to include potential victims from months or possibly years of illegal recording. We spent the next several hours giving statements to various law enforcement officials, and it wasn't until nearly dawn that we finally checked into a different hotel, a modern chain where everything was sterile and corporate but at least felt safe. Neither of us slept that night, both of us thinking about how many innocent people had been recorded without their knowledge, their most intimate moments transformed into someone's sick entertainment. The legal aftermath has been extensive and exhausting, with multiple lawsuits filed against the hotel, though the criminal investigation is still ongoing as they try to identify everyone involved in the operation. We've been told it could take years before there's any real resolution, and in the meantime, we're both dealing with the psychological impact of knowing we were violated in such a fundamental way. Michael has developed an almost obsessive need to check for cameras everywhere we go, spending the first 10 minutes in any new space examining every surface, every fixture, every possible hiding spot. I can't use public bathrooms without feeling physically ill, and we haven't been able to be intimate because the thought that someone might be watching has destroyed our ability to feel safe in private spaces. The hotel has since been shut down pending the investigation, but that feels like too little too late for all the victims who were recorded there. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering how many people have seen footage of us, whether those files are still out there somewhere on the internet, permanently beyond our ability to control or delete them. The gym locker room horror. I'd been a member at Fit Life Wellness Center for almost 3 years, one of those locally owned gyms that prided itself on being a community hub rather than just another corporate fitness chain, where the owner knew everyone's name and the regular members felt more like extended family than strangers working out side by side. The membership was more expensive than the big box gyms, but I justified it because the equipment was always well maintained, the classes were small and personal, and the locker rooms were actually clean and private, or so I thought. It was a Tuesday evening in November when everything changed, and I just finished a particularly intense spin class that left me drenched in sweat and desperately needing a long hot shower. The women's locker room was mostly empty since it was later in the evening, maybe 9:30, with just myself and one other woman who was already getting dressed when I entered the shower area. I chose the stall furthest from the entrance because it had the best water pressure, something all the regulars knew, and I was standing under the stream of hot water, letting it wash away the exhaustion from the workout, when I noticed something unusual about the tile pattern on the wall. There was one tile about 7 feet up that didn't quite match the others, slightly different in color and texture, and it had what looked like a small dark circle in its center that I'd never noticed before in all my years of using that shower. The more I stared at it, the more wrong it looked, and despite telling myself I was being ridiculous, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dark circle looked exactly like a camera lens. I quickly finished my shower, wrapped myself in my towel, and went back to my locker, but the image of that tile stayed in my mind, nagging at me with increasing intensity. Instead of getting dressed and leaving like I normally would, I found myself walking back to the shower stall and examining the tile more carefully, standing on the small bench meant for shaving legs to get a closer look. My worst fears were confirmed when I could clearly see that someone had drilled through the tile and installed a tiny camera, painted to almost match the grout but not quite perfectly. My entire body went cold despite the residual warmth from the shower, and I felt suddenly exposed and vulnerable standing there in just a towel, knowing that camera had been watching who knows how many women for who knows how long. I took several photos with my phone, my hands trembling so badly that most of them came out blurry, but I managed to get a few clear shots that showed the camera lens unmistakably. I threw on my clothes without properly drying off, not caring that my shirt stuck uncomfortably to my damp skin, and practically ran to the front desk where a young employee named Tyler was scrolling through his phone looking bored. When I told him what I'd found, he initially looked at me like I was crazy, but when I showed him the photos, his expression changed to one of genuine alarm. He immediately called the owner, Marcus, who lived only 10 minutes away, and promised to come immediately. While we waited, Tyler and I went back to the locker room, which he wasn't supposed to enter but did anyway given the circumstances, and we discovered more cameras hidden in other shower stalls, all positioned at the same height and angle, all painted to blend in with the tile work. Marcus arrived looking flustered and panicked, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered as he surveyed the cameras we'd found. He kept insisting he had no knowledge of them, that he'd never authorized any surveillance in the locker rooms, and that he was as shocked and disgusted as we were. The police arrived shortly after, and the gym was immediately closed while they conducted their investigation. What they discovered over the next few hours turned my stomach in ways I still can't fully process. The cameras were all connected to a central recording system hidden in a maintenance room that only a few employees had access to, and the amount of recorded footage they found suggested the cameras had been operating for at least 6 months. The investigation eventually led to the arrest of the gym's maintenance supervisor, a man named Carl who'd worked there for over 5 years and who everyone had trusted implicitly. He'd been the friendly guy who always had a smile and a wave, who knew everyone's names and asked about their families, and all that time he'd been secretly recording women in their most vulnerable moments. The detectives told me they found thousands of hours of footage on his home computer, carefully organized and labeled with dates and sometimes even names when he recognized regular members. The thought that he'd been watching us, cataloging us like some sick collection, made me physically vomit when I got home that night. The gym permanently closed within a week, Marcus unable to recover from the scandal even though he appeared to genuinely have been unaware of what was happening. Dozens of women came forward as victims, and the legal proceedings have been ongoing for months now, with Carl facing numerous felony charges that will hopefully result in significant prison time. But the damage to all of us who were recorded can't be undone by his punishment. I haven't been able to join another gym, the thought of being vulnerable in a locker room making me break out in cold sweats. I've gained 15 pounds because I can't bring myself to exercise anywhere except in my own home, and even there I find myself checking the walls and ceilings for anything that looks suspicious. Several of us have formed a support group, meeting once a week to talk about the impact this has had on our lives, but it's hard to find comfort when we all share the same horrible knowledge that somewhere out there footage of our naked bodies might still exist on some hard drive or dark corner of the internet. The betrayal feels especially sharp because Carl had been someone we trusted, someone who was part of our community, who we'd made small talk with and considered a friend. Learning that he'd been viewing us as objects for his sick gratification the entire time has made it nearly impossible for me to trust anyone, especially men in positions of authority or access. The massage parlor nightmare. I'd been seeing the same massage therapist, Linda, for over 2 years to help manage chronic back pain from a car accident, and her small practice operated out of a converted Victorian house in the historic district of our town, painted pale yellow with white trim and surrounded by a well-maintained garden that gave the whole place a peaceful, therapeutic atmosphere. Linda rented rooms to several other wellness practitioners, including an acupuncturist, a Reiki healer, and another massage therapist named James who specialized in sports injuries. The setup was perfect for me since Linda understood exactly how to work with my specific injuries, and over time we developed the kind of comfortable rapport that made the vulnerable experience of massage therapy feel safe and healing rather than awkward. The room where she worked was small but perfectly arranged, with soft lighting from Himalayan salt lamps, gentle music always playing at just the right volume, and an essential oil diffuser that filled the space with lavender and eucalyptus. It was during my regular Thursday afternoon appointment in early December when I noticed something that would shatter my sense of safety forever. I was lying face down on the massage table, my face positioned in the padded face cradle, when I opened my eyes briefly and noticed something odd about the floor beneath me through the small opening. There was what looked like a phone or small tablet propped against the wall under the table, positioned at an angle that seemed deliberately placed rather than accidentally dropped, and the screen was dark but I could see a tiny red light that usually indicates recording. My body tensed immediately and Linda, who was working on my shoulders, asked if I was okay if she'd hit a tender spot. I told her I needed to sit up for a moment, claiming I felt dizzy, and when she stepped back with concern, I quickly leaned over the edge of the table and grabbed the device. It was definitely recording, the camera app open and actively capturing video, and when I showed it to Linda, her face went white with shock and confusion. She immediately insisted she had no idea how it got there, that she'd never seen it before, and I could tell from her genuine distress that she was telling the truth. We stopped the recording and looked at the phone more carefully, discovering it wasn't password protected and contained dozens of videos in the gallery, all apparently taken in various rooms throughout the wellness center. The videos were all of partially or completely undressed women receiving treatments, captured from angles that showed everything, and the dates on the files went back several months. Some were taken in Linda's room when she wasn't there, presumably when other practitioners were using the space, and others were from the room next door where James worked. Linda was crying by this point, horrified that this had been happening in her practice without her knowledge, and she immediately called the police while I got dressed with shaking hands. When I looked at more of the videos while we waited, I recognized several women I knew from town, including my sister-in-law who'd been coming here for prenatal massages, and the violation felt even more personal and enraging. The police arrived quickly and immediately seized the phone as evidence, but they also needed to search the entire building for additional recording devices. What they found was a sophisticated setup that made it clear this wasn't just a crime of opportunity but a carefully planned operation that had been going on for who knows how long. There were tiny cameras hidden in the heating vents of multiple rooms, all wireless and battery-powered, so small they were nearly invisible unless you were specifically looking for them. The feeds from these cameras were being transmitted to recording equipment found in a storage closet that James had exclusive access to, along with external hard drives containing what investigators described as an enormous amount of footage. James was arrested at his apartment that evening, and the investigation revealed he'd been selling the recordings online, marketing them as real hidden camera massage content on various adult websites. The thought that hundreds or thousands of strangers had watched women in their most vulnerable moments, seeking healing and relief from pain, only to be exploited for sexual gratification, made me alternate between rage and despair. Linda had to close her practice permanently, the scandal destroying her reputation even though she was as much a victim as the rest of us. The other practitioners who rented space from her also had to find new locations, their businesses tainted by association with what had happened even though they'd done nothing wrong. The legal proceedings have been complex and emotionally draining, with prosecutors charging James with multiple felonies including voyeurism, invasion of privacy, and distribution of non-consensual pornography. But knowing he'll likely go to prison doesn't undo the damage or remove those videos from wherever they've been downloaded and saved by anonymous perverts on the internet. I haven't been able to receive any kind of therapeutic treatment since then, my back pain returning with a vengeance, but my inability to be vulnerable in that way again making it impossible to seek help. The thought of taking my clothes off in any medical or therapeutic setting triggers panic attacks that leave me gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. My relationship with my husband has suffered because I can't be intimate without wondering if somehow we're being watched, if there's another camera hidden somewhere we haven't found. I've become paranoid about every small hole in every wall, every vent, every suspicious-looking fixture, spending hours searching our own home for devices that probably don't exist. The dressing room violation. Shopping for clothes had always been one of my favorite forms of self-care, especially at Bella's Boutique, a high-end women's clothing store in the upscale shopping district where the sales associates knew my style preferences and the dressing rooms were spacious and private with flattering lighting that made everything look better. I'd been shopping there for years, probably spending more money than I should have on designer pieces, but justifying it as an investment in quality wardrobe staples that would last forever. It was a Saturday afternoon in January when I'd gone in to take advantage of their semi-annual sale, armed with a credit card I'd specifically saved for this occasion and ready to try on at least a dozen pieces I'd been eyeing online. The store was busier than usual because of the sale, but the staff still provided their typical attentive service, with an associate named Michelle helping me gather items in my size and setting me up in one of their larger corner dressing rooms. The room was beautifully appointed with a plush ottoman, multiple hooks for hanging clothes, and mirrors on 3 walls that allowed you to see every angle, which I'd always appreciated when trying to decide if something was truly flattering. I'd been trying on clothes for about 20 minutes, working my way through a pile of dresses and blazers, when I noticed something odd about one of the mirrors. In the upper corner of the mirror on the left wall, there was what looked like a small imperfection in the glass, almost like a bubble or chip, but when I looked closer I realized it was perfectly round and had a different quality than a normal flaw would have. My heart started racing as I moved closer to examine it, and when I put my eye right up to it, I could see that it wasn't a flaw at all but a small hole that had been drilled through the mirror with something dark behind it. I immediately put my clothes back on, not caring that I was mixing up the items I'd tried with the ones I hadn't, and walked out to find Michelle to quietly tell her what I'd discovered. Her initial reaction was confusion, then disbelief, but when I insisted she come look for herself, her face went pale as she confirmed what I'd seen. She immediately got the store manager, an elegant woman named Patricia who'd always been professionally friendly but distant, and when Patricia saw the hole in the mirror, her entire demeanor changed from composed to panicked. She quickly ushered me into her office while simultaneously calling what I assumed was the store's corporate security team. While we waited for security to arrive, Patricia had another employee quietly check the other dressing rooms without alerting the customers who were using them, and they found similar holes in 3 of the 6 mirrors, all positioned at roughly chest height when someone would be standing in front of them trying on clothes. The mall security arrived first, followed quickly by the actual police, and the store had to be closed immediately, with customers being asked to leave without much explanation, which caused considerable confusion and anger among the shoppers who didn't understand what was happening. The investigation that followed revealed something that still makes me feel sick when I think about it. Behind the mirrors was a narrow maintenance corridor that ran between the dressing rooms and the storage area, a space that most employees didn't even know existed but that certain maintenance personnel and managers had access to for plumbing and electrical work. Hidden in that corridor, investigators found cameras positioned at each hole, connected to a recording system that had been professionally installed with careful cable management and power supplies that suggested this wasn't a recent addition but something that had been operating for potentially years. The investigation eventually led to the arrest of the store's regional loss prevention manager, a man named Richard who'd been with the company for over a decade and had used his position to install similar setups in multiple stores across 3 states. He'd been compiling and selling the footage online, creating what investigators described as a massive library of non-consensual recordings of women in various states of undress. The scope of the violation was staggering, with potentially thousands of victims across all the stores where he'd installed cameras. The company has been hit with numerous lawsuits, and while they claim they had no knowledge of Richard's actions, the fact that he was able to install such elaborate surveillance systems without detection suggests a massive failure of oversight. I've had to provide testimony multiple times, both to police and in depositions for the civil lawsuits, and each time I have to relive the horrible realization that I'd been watched during what I thought were private moments. The number of times I'd changed in that room over the years, sometimes trying on lingerie or swimsuits, makes me physically ill to contemplate. I can't shop for clothes anymore without having a panic attack, and when I absolutely have to buy something, I order it online and deal with the hassle of returns rather than trying anything on in a store. The financial settlement from the lawsuit won't come close to compensating for the psychological damage and the permanent change in how I navigate the world. The physical therapy betrayal. After my knee surgery, my orthopedic surgeon referred me to a physical therapy clinic that specialized in sports injury rehabilitation, a modern facility with state-of-the-art equipment and a reputation for getting athletes back to peak performance faster than their competitors. I wasn't an athlete, just someone who'd torn their ACL skiing, but I wanted the best possible recovery, so I committed to the intensive 3-times-a-week program despite the cost and inconvenience. The clinic was impressive from the moment I walked in, with its gleaming equipment, motivational posters featuring recovered athletes, and a staff that seemed genuinely invested in each patient's progress. My primary therapist was a man named Dr. Bradley, though he insisted everyone call him just Brad, who had an impressive resume including work with professional sports teams and a wall full of certifications and degrees. The therapy sessions were challenging but effective, and Brad had a way of pushing me just hard enough to make progress without causing additional injury. The clinic had private treatment rooms for manual therapy and exercises that required more personal attention, and I appreciated the privacy since some of the positions and movements required for proper rehabilitation weren't exactly dignified. It was during my 6th week of treatment when I noticed something that would change everything. Brad had stepped out to get a piece of equipment from another room, and I was lying on the treatment table doing prescribed stretches when I saw what looked like a small black dome on the ceiling that I'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind an air vent but visible from the specific angle where I was positioned. At first, I tried to convince myself it was probably just a smoke detector or some kind of sensor, but the more I looked at it, the more it resembled the security cameras I'd seen in stores. When Brad returned, I asked him about it casually, trying not to sound suspicious, and his reaction immediately confirmed my worst fears. He stuttered for a moment, his usual confident demeanor cracking, before claiming it was a security camera that was only activated after hours for insurance purposes. But his explanation didn't make sense because security cameras would be visible and disclosed to patients, not hidden behind vents, and his nervous behavior made it clear he was lying. I made an excuse about needing to use the restroom and instead went directly to the reception desk, where I quietly asked to speak with the clinic director immediately about a serious concern. The director, Dr. Sarah Coleman, took me to her office where I explained what I'd seen and Brad's suspicious reaction. Dr. Coleman's face went through a series of expressions from confusion to horror as she processed what I was telling her, and she immediately called their IT security consultant while also asking me to show her exactly what I'd seen. When we returned to the treatment room, Brad was gone, apparently having left the building suddenly claiming he felt ill. The security consultant arrived within an hour and confirmed that the device was indeed a camera that wasn't part of any legitimate security system. Further investigation revealed cameras in 4 of the 6 private treatment rooms, all positioned to capture the treatment tables where patients would be in various states of undress during manual therapy and certain exercises. The police were called immediately, and their investigation uncovered something even more disturbing than just the hidden cameras. Brad had been using his position to specifically request female patients for his caseload, especially those recovering from injuries that required extensive manual therapy or exercises that involved removing clothing to properly access the affected areas. On his home computer, investigators found hundreds of hours of footage, meticulously organized by patient name and date, with some files having been edited to create compilation videos that he'd been sharing on private forums dedicated to voyeuristic content. The thought that strangers on the internet had been watching my therapy sessions, seeing me in vulnerable positions while working through painful exercises, made me vomit repeatedly that night. Brad was arrested at his apartment the next day, and the investigation revealed he'd been doing this for at least 2 years, affecting dozens of patients who trusted him with their recovery. The clinic has since closed permanently, unable to recover from the scandal, and all the other therapists who worked there have had their careers unfairly tainted by association. The physical impact has been significant because I stopped my rehabilitation program before it was complete, too traumatized to continue physical therapy elsewhere. My knee hasn't healed properly as a result, and I'm facing the possibility of additional surgery that might have been avoided if I'd been able to complete the proper rehabilitation protocol. But the psychological impact has been even worse, with recurring nightmares about being watched, inability to trust medical professionals, and a constant state of hypervigilance that's exhausting to maintain. I've had to start seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, but even in her office, I spend the first few minutes of each session examining the room for cameras, unable to fully relax even in what should be a safe therapeutic space. The legal proceedings are ongoing, with both criminal charges against Brad and civil lawsuits against the clinic and their insurance companies. But no amount of money or jail time will undo the violation or restore my ability to seek medical care without fear. And knowing that videos of my most vulnerable moments might exist forever on the internet is a weight I'll carry for the rest of my life. The overnight pet sitting nightmare. My name is Rachel, and I've been running a small pet sitting business from my home for about 3 years, building up a steady clientele of neighbors and local families who trusted me with their beloved animals when they traveled for work or vacation. It was the perfect job for me since I'd always loved animals but couldn't commit to having my own due to my unpredictable schedule as a freelance graphic designer, and the extra income helped cover my mortgage on the small house I'd bought in a quiet suburb. One of my regular clients, Mrs. Patterson, had recommended me to her book club friend, a woman named Diana who lived in an upscale neighborhood about 20 minutes away and needed someone to watch her 2 Persian cats for 10 days while she went on a Mediterranean cruise. Diana seemed perfectly normal when we met for the initial consultation, maybe a bit overly detailed in her instructions about the cat's feeding schedules and preferences, but I'd dealt with particular pet owners before and didn't think much of it. Her house was one of those modern McMansions with too many rooms for one person, decorated in that sterile all-white aesthetic that looked like a furniture showroom rather than a lived-in home. She showed me around, pointing out where she kept the cat food, the special filtered water the cats apparently required, and the guest bedroom where I could stay since she preferred someone to be there overnight rather than just stopping by twice a day. The guest room was on the 2nd floor, decorated in shades of beige and cream with a large bed that looked like it had never been slept in and an ensuite bathroom with marble countertops and a Rainfall shower that probably cost more than my car. Diana mentioned offhandedly that the room had been her daughter's before she'd moved to California for college, though there were no personal touches or photos that suggested anyone had actually lived there. The first 3 nights passed without incident, with the cats mostly ignoring me except at feeding times, and I spent my days working on design projects from my laptop while enjoying the luxury of a house much nicer than my own. But on the 4th night, something happened that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I'd just gotten out of the shower and was wrapping myself in one of the plush towels Diana had left out when I noticed something reflecting oddly in the bathroom mirror. Behind me, in what looked like a decorative air vent near the ceiling, there was a tiny glint of something that caught the light in a way that metal or glass would, not the flat black of a normal vent cover. Standing on the toilet lid to get a closer look, I discovered what I'd feared the moment I saw that reflection. A small camera lens positioned perfectly to capture the entire bathroom, including the shower and the area where someone would stand to get dressed. My entire body went cold despite the steam still filling the room from my hot shower, and I grabbed my phone to take photos before quickly getting dressed. But that was just the beginning of my discoveries that night. Once I started looking, really looking, I found cameras everywhere in that guest room. There was one hidden in what looked like a phone charger plugged into the wall outlet facing the bed, another concealed in a decorative clock on the dresser, and most disturbingly, one built into what appeared to be a smoke detector directly above the bed. My first instinct was to grab my things and leave immediately, but then I thought about the cats who needed care and the fact that I had no actual proof Diana had installed these cameras versus some previous owner or even a maintenance person. So instead, I did something that might have been stupid but felt necessary at the time. I started searching the rest of the house. What I found in Diana's home office made everything infinitely worse. Her computer was password protected, but she'd left a filing cabinet unlocked that contained printed screenshots from what were clearly surveillance feeds, not just of the guest room but of multiple rooms throughout the house. The dates on some of these printouts went back years, and there were handwritten notes about the people in the images, details about their habits, their conversations, their private moments. One folder was labeled with my name, already containing several screenshots from the past few days, including images of me sleeping, changing clothes, and even sitting on the toilet. The violation felt like physical assault, making me dizzy and nauseous as I realized she'd been watching me from the moment I'd arrived, probably from some remote location on her cruise ship. I called the police immediately, my voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself several times. While waiting for them to arrive, I also called Mrs. Patterson, who was horrified and admitted that Diana had asked her lots of personal questions about me before requesting the recommendation. Questions she thought were just about ensuring I was trustworthy but now seemed much more sinister. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes, and after I showed them what I'd found, they called for additional units and a detective who specialized in cyber crimes. The investigation that unfolded over the next several hours revealed something that still gives me nightmares about how wrong I'd been to trust this situation. Diana's house was essentially a high-tech voyeurism operation, with cameras in every room including the main bathroom and what had been advertised as a second guest room in the basement. The detective found a sophisticated server set up in a locked closet that was storing terabytes of footage, not just recent but going back at least 5 years based on the file dates. They discovered that Diana had been running her own version of a bed and breakfast through various platforms, but instead of advertising it openly, she would approach people through personal connections, always with some story about needing a house sitter or offering a room to a friend of a friend. Every single person who'd stayed in her home had been recorded without their knowledge, their most private moments captured and stored. The police managed to contact Diana on her cruise ship, and she was arrested the moment she docked back in Miami, charged with multiple felonies including voyeurism, invasion of privacy, and what they discovered later, selling access to her surveillance feeds to subscribers on the dark web who paid premium prices for what she marketed as authentic hidden camera content. The investigation revealed at least 40 victims over the years, people who'd thought they were doing her a favor or getting a good deal on a nice place to stay, never knowing they were being exploited for the entertainment of perverts on the internet. The psychological impact on all of us has been devastating, with several victims forming a support group that meets monthly to deal with the ongoing trauma. I had to close my pet-sitting business because I couldn't handle being in other people's homes anymore, constantly paranoid about hidden cameras and unable to relax even in spaces I'd previously felt comfortable. The financial hit has been significant, but not as bad as the psychological damage that therapy hasn't been able to fully address even after months of sessions. The legal case is still ongoing, with Diana trying to claim diminished capacity due to some manufactured mental health crisis, but the prosecutors have extensive evidence of her calculated planning and the profit she made from selling these recordings. Several of us have also filed civil suits, though no amount of money will ever make us feel safe in private spaces again. The apartment building horror. I'd lived in the Riverside Commons apartment complex for almost 4 years, a modest but well-maintained building with 40 units that attracted mostly young professionals and graduate students who needed something affordable but safe in a decent part of the city. The building had that classic 1970s architecture with long hallways and identical doors, but the landlord, Mr. Chin, kept everything clean and responded quickly to maintenance requests, which was more than you could say for most rental properties in our price range. My apartment was a 1-bedroom unit on the 4th floor, nothing fancy but comfortable enough with good natural light and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves except for polite greetings in the hallway or elevator. I developed a routine over the years, feeling secure in my space and the predictability of my environment, until one evening in February when everything changed. I'd been having issues with my bathroom ventilation fan making strange noises, a grinding sound that suggested the motor was failing, so I'd submitted a maintenance request through the building's online portal. Mr. Chin responded quickly as usual, saying he'd have someone look at it the next day while I was at work, which was standard procedure since he had keys to all units for emergency access. When I came home that evening, there was a note on my kitchen counter saying the maintenance had been completed, the fan had been replaced, and apologizing for any inconvenience. The new fan was indeed quieter, and I thought nothing more of it until about a week later when I noticed something odd while cleaning the bathroom. The new fan looked different from the old one, which made sense since it was a replacement, But what caught my attention was a small black dot in the center of the grating that didn't look like it belonged there. Standing on the edge of the bathtub to get a closer look, I could see what appeared to be a tiny lens nestled among the ventilation slats, positioned to overlook the entire bathroom. My heart started racing as I grabbed a screwdriver and carefully removed the fan cover, revealing exactly what I'd feared. A small wireless camera attached to the inside of the housing, its lens pointing down through a hole that had been deliberately drilled in the plastic. The camera was still active, a small green light indicating it was transmitting, and I felt sick thinking about the past week of showers, of using the toilet, of everything I'd done in what I thought was the privacy of my own bathroom. I immediately called the police, but while waiting for them to arrive, I started thinking about the implications. If this was in my bathroom, what about other apartments? Were other tenants being watched without their knowledge? Was this just my unit or something more widespread? The two officers who responded took the situation seriously, especially when I pointed out that the camera had been installed during official maintenance work ordered by the building management. They documented everything, took the camera as evidence, and then made a decision that would reveal the true scope of the violation. They wanted to check other apartments. With Mr. Chin mysteriously unavailable by phone, the officers started knocking on doors, explaining the situation and asking permission to inspect bathroom fans, particularly in units that had recent maintenance work done. What they found was absolutely horrifying. Cameras in 12 different apartments, all installed in bathroom ventilation fans, all transmitting wirelessly to somewhere we couldn't immediately determine. The building erupted into chaos as word spread, with tenants gathering in the hallways sharing their horror and rage, comparing notes about when they'd had maintenance done and realizing the pattern. Every camera had been installed during legitimate maintenance requests, giving whoever was responsible perfect access to our apartments with our permission. By late evening, a full investigation was underway with multiple detectives, crime scene technicians, and even a specialist in electronic surveillance who worked to trace where the cameras were transmitting. The trail led to a locked utility room in the basement that supposedly only contained building maintenance equipment and supplies. Inside that room, investigators found a sophisticated setup that looked like something from a spy movie. Multiple monitors, recording equipment, hard drives, and a computer system that was receiving feeds from all the cameras throughout the building. The amount of recorded footage was staggering, with files dating back over 2 years and labeled with apartment numbers and tenant names. The investigation initially focused on Mr. Chin, but he seemed genuinely shocked when he was brought in for questioning, and his confusion appeared real when shown the surveillance setup. The truth turned out to be even more disturbing. The actual perpetrator was his nephew, Kevin Chin, who'd been working as the building's maintenance supervisor for the past 3 years. Kevin had been using his legitimate access to apartments to install cameras during routine maintenance calls, specifically targeting units rented by young women living alone or couples he found attractive. He'd been selling access to these feeds through a subscription service on the dark web, marketing them as real apartment voyeur cams to subscribers who paid monthly fees for unlimited viewing. The discovery in my apartment had uncovered an operation that generated thousands of dollars monthly from perverts around the world who were watching us in our most private moments. The police found evidence that Kevin had been planning to expand to other buildings his uncle owned, having already purchased more camera equipment that was found in his personal vehicle. The psychological impact on everyone in the building has been profound and lasting. Several tenants broke their leases and moved out immediately, unable to stay in apartments where they'd been violated so thoroughly. Others, like me, wanted to leave but couldn't afford the financial hit of breaking a lease and finding a new place quickly in an expensive rental market. We formed a tenants association to pursue legal action collectively, both criminal charges against Kevin and civil suits against the property management company for failing to properly supervise their maintenance staff. The legal proceedings have been slow and emotionally draining, requiring us to testify about the intimate details of our lives and the impact of knowing strangers watched us during our most private moments. I still live in the same apartment because I can't afford to move yet, but I've never been able to feel safe there again. I've covered every vent with tape, disabled the bathroom fan entirely despite the moisture problems this causes, and shower at the gym instead of my own bathroom. The hypervigilance is exhausting, constantly checking for tiny holes in walls, examining every surface for anything that might be a camera. The yoga studio catastrophe. For 5 years, Inner Light Yoga had been my sanctuary, a small studio run by a woman named Sage who'd created the most welcoming, peaceful environment where people of all skill levels felt comfortable practicing together. The studio was located in a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls, large windows that let in natural light, and a sense of authentic community that the corporate yoga chains could never replicate. I'd progressed from a complete beginner who couldn't touch my toes to someone who could hold advanced poses, and along the way I'd formed genuine friendships with other regular practitioners who'd become like a chosen family. We shared not just yoga practice but life celebrations, struggles, and support through various challenges, making the studio feel like a second home. The hot yoga classes were particularly popular, held in a specially designed room with heated panels and humidity control that created the perfect environment for deep stretching and detoxification. The room had mirrors on one wall for checking form, bamboo flooring that felt warm under bare feet, and soft lighting that created an almost womb-like atmosphere of safety and comfort. It was during a particularly intense hot yoga session on a Thursday evening when I first noticed something wrong. We were in child's pose, a resting position with our foreheads on the mat, when I opened my eyes and saw something unusual about the bamboo flooring. Between two boards, there was a tiny gap that seemed to have something dark and circular visible through it, almost like someone had drilled a hole and filled it with something that didn't quite match. I tried to ignore it and continue with the practice, but the image nagged at me throughout the remaining poses. After class, while everyone else was rolling up their mats and chatting, I went back to examine that spot more closely, pretending to stretch while actually getting a better look at what I'd seen. My blood ran cold when I realized it was definitely a camera lens, so small it was nearly invisible unless you were looking directly at it from the right angle. I took a quick photo with my phone, then looked around the room more carefully and found 3 more similar spots, all positioned to capture different angles of the room where people would be in various yoga positions. Instead of causing a scene with the other students still present, I quietly asked Sage if I could speak with her privately about something urgent. In her office, I showed her the photos I'd taken, and watched her face transform from confusion to horror as she processed what this meant for her studio and her students. She immediately wanted to check the other practice rooms, and what we found destroyed everything that studio had meant to all of us. There were cameras in the main practice room, the hot yoga room, and most violatingly in the changing areas where people would be completely undressed while switching from street clothes to yoga attire. Sage called the police while I helped her clear the building, making up an excuse about a gas leak to get everyone out without causing panic. When the investigators arrived and began their search, they found a total of 17 cameras throughout the facility, all professionally installed and hidden with a level of expertise that suggested this wasn't someone's amateur operation. The cameras were all wired into the building's electrical system, hidden behind walls and above ceiling tiles, transmitting to recording equipment found in a storage area that was supposed to be unused. The investigation revealed that the building's owner, a man named Richard Torres who owned several commercial properties in the area, had been secretly recording everything happening in the yoga studio for over 3 years. The enormity of the violation was staggering when we considered how vulnerable people are during yoga practice, wearing minimal, tight-fitting clothing, bodies in positions that could be sexualized, completely unaware they were being watched and recorded. The hot yoga classes were particularly targeted, with multiple cameras focused on that room where people would be sweating, stretching, and in their most physically exposed state. Richard had been selling the footage through multiple channels, including subscription websites and private collectors who paid premium prices for what he marketed as real yoga voyeur content. The police found financial records showing he'd made hundreds of thousands of dollars from violating the privacy and dignity of people who'd simply been trying to practice yoga for their health and well-being. The studio closed immediately and never reopened, with Sage too traumatized and financially ruined by lawsuits to continue teaching. The community we'd built scattered, unable to face each other knowing we'd all been violated together, our shared vulnerability transformed from something healing into something horrific. I haven't been able to return to yoga practice anywhere, the thought of being in those positions while potentially being watched making me physically ill. The flexibility and strength I'd worked years to develop have deteriorated, along with the mental peace and stress relief that yoga had provided, replaced by anxiety and paranoia that no amount of therapy has been able to fully address. The criminal case against Richard is ongoing, complicated by his wealth and legal team trying to claim the cameras were for security purposes despite their placement in changing areas. The civil lawsuits from dozens of victims are similarly complex, with his insurance companies fighting every claim and forcing us to relive our trauma through depositions and court testimony. The medical clinic disaster. I'd been going to the same women's health clinic for 8 years, a small practice with 3 doctors and a nurse practitioner who provided compassionate, comprehensive care in an environment that felt more like visiting a friend than a medical facility. Dr. Martinez had delivered both of my children, seen me through postpartum depression, and provided the kind of consistent, personal care that's increasingly rare in modern medicine. The clinic occupied the second floor of a medical building with comfortable waiting rooms decorated in soothing colors, examination rooms that felt private and safe, and staff who remembered not just your medical history but your children's names and your job struggles. It was the kind of place where you could be vulnerable about intimate health issues without feeling judged or rushed. During what should have been a routine annual examination, I was lying on the examination table waiting for Dr. Martinez when I noticed something that seemed out of place. In the corner of the ceiling, partially hidden behind a heating vent, there was what looked like a small dome of dark plastic that didn't match anything else in the room's clinical white environment. When Dr. Martinez entered, I pointed it out and asked what it was, trying to keep my voice casual despite the growing unease in my stomach. Her face immediately showed confusion as she looked where I was pointing, and she said she'd never noticed it before and had no idea what it could be, certainly not any medical equipment she was aware of. She got a step stool to look closer, and when she saw what it was, her face went pale and she immediately told me to get dressed while she called the police. It was indeed a camera, positioned to record the examination table from an angle that would capture everything during gynecological exams and other intimate procedures. The police response was immediate and thorough, with female officers ensuring I felt safe while gathering my statement and male officers searching the rest of the clinic for additional devices. What they found was a nightmare scenario that made everyone involved physically sick. Cameras in all 4 examination rooms, the ultrasound room, and even the bathroom patients used for urine samples. The cameras were all wireless, battery-powered devices that had been painted to match the ceiling color and positioned carefully to be nearly invisible unless you were specifically looking for them. They were all transmitting to a receiver that the police traced to a vacant office on the 3rd floor of the building, directly above the clinic. In that office, investigators found recording equipment, multiple hard drives, and evidence that someone had been accessing the space regularly to download footage and change batteries in the cameras. The amount of recorded material suggested this had been going on for at least 18 months, possibly longer. The investigation led to the arrest of a man named Dale Morrison, who worked for the building's maintenance company and had master keys to all offices for emergency access. He'd been using his legitimate access to install and maintain the cameras, specifically targeting the women's clinic, though investigators also found cameras in a dermatology office on the 1st floor where patients would undress for skin examinations. The scope of the violation was incomprehensible, with potentially thousands of women recorded during their most vulnerable medical moments, examinations that required undressing, positioning in stirrups, breast exams, and other intimate procedures that require complete trust between patient and provider. Dale had been selling these recordings on multiple platforms, categorizing them by procedure type and patient appearance in a sick catalog of medical voyeurism. Dr. Martinez and her partners had to close the clinic permanently, unable to recover from the scandal despite being victims themselves. The impact on their professional reputations was devastating, with some people unfairly blaming them for not detecting the cameras sooner, even though they'd been expertly hidden by someone with unlimited access to the space. I haven't been able to seek gynecological care since then, canceling appointments and avoiding necessary medical examinations because the thought of being in that vulnerable position again triggers panic attacks. My health has suffered as a result, with conditions going untreated because I can't overcome the psychological barrier of medical vulnerability. The support group formed by victims has been helpful but also heartbreaking, hearing stories from women who were recorded during pregnancy ultrasounds, fertility treatments, cancer screenings, and other deeply personal medical moments. Some women were recorded during procedures following sexual assault, adding another layer of violation to their existing trauma. The co-working space invasion. After leaving my corporate job to start my own consulting business, I'd rented a dedicated desk at the Hub, a trendy co-working space that offered the perfect balance of professional environment and creative energy, with modern design, reliable Wi-Fi, unlimited coffee, and a community of fellow entrepreneurs who understood the challenges of building something from nothing. The space occupied 2 floors of a renovated historic building with open work areas, private phone booths for calls, conference rooms for client meetings, and small private offices available for hourly rental when you needed complete privacy. I'd been working there for almost 2 years, developing friendships with other regulars and feeling like I'd found my professional home. My dedicated desk was in a corner with nice natural light, and I'd personalized it with plants, photos, and the kind of organizational systems that made me feel productive and professional. The community manager, an energetic woman named Ashley, knew everyone by name and worked hard to create networking opportunities and social events that made the space feel like more than just a place to work. It was during a particularly busy period when I'd booked one of the private offices for a full day to focus on a major client presentation that I discovered something that would shatter my sense of security. I'd been working for several hours when I dropped my pen, and as I bent down to retrieve it from under the desk, I noticed something odd about the power outlet on the wall. One of the outlets looked different from the others, with what appeared to be a small dark circle in the center that definitely wasn't normal. Getting down on my hands and knees to look closer, I realized with growing horror that it was a camera lens built into what looked like a functional electrical outlet, positioned to capture anyone working at the desk. I immediately left the room and found Ashley, pulling her aside to quietly explain what I'd found. Her initial disbelief turned to alarm when I showed her photos I'd taken, and she made the decision to quietly check the other private offices while I waited in the main co-working area, trying to act normal despite my racing heart. Within 20 minutes, Ashley had confirmed cameras in all 6 private offices, each one hidden in fake electrical outlets, smoke detectors or ventilation grates, all positioned to capture people working at the desks or having meetings at the small tables. She immediately called the building owner and the police, and within an hour the entire co-working space was closed for investigation. What the investigators uncovered was more extensive than anyone could have imagined. There were cameras not just in the private offices but also in the phone booths where people took confidential calls, the wellness room where nursing mothers pumped milk, and even in the communal kitchen where people would eat lunch and have casual conversations. The cameras were all connected to a sophisticated recording system hidden in a utility closet that supposedly only building maintenance could access. The amount of recorded footage was massive, with files organized by date and location, some tagged with names of regular members who used certain spaces frequently. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator was the building's IT contractor, a man named Marcus Webb who'd been hired to install and maintain the Wi-Fi and security systems throughout the building. He'd used his legitimate access and technical expertise to create a comprehensive surveillance network that captured not just video but audio, recording confidential business calls, private conversations and personal moments. Marcus had been selling access to the feeds on the dark web, marketing them to corporate spies and criminals interested in insider information from the startups and small businesses using the space. Several members discovered their business plans, client lists, and confidential strategies had been compromised, leading to lost contracts and failed ventures they couldn't explain until learning about the surveillance. The impact on everyone who'd used the space was devastating, both professionally and personally. People had conducted therapy sessions over video calls in those phone booths, had sensitive conversations with lawyers about divorces or lawsuits, had broken down crying during stressful periods thinking they were in private spaces where they could let their guard down. I lost 3 major clients who no longer trusted that our communications had been confidential, even though I'd never discussed their business in the compromised spaces. The paranoia about whether competitors had accessed information about my business strategies and client relationships has made it impossible to work effectively, second-guessing every setback and wondering if it's because someone had inside information. The co-working space closed permanently, unable to recover from the reputational damage, and many of the small businesses that had operated there struggled to recover from both the violation and the sudden loss of their workspace. The legal battles are ongoing, with both criminal charges against Marcus and civil suits against the building owner and co-working space management for failing to protect our privacy and confidential business information. I now work from home, unable to trust shared workspaces despite the isolation and lack of professional community this creates. Every video call makes me anxious, wondering if someone might be watching or recording beyond the intended participants. The violation of that space transformed from professional paranoia into personal trauma that affects every aspect of how I conduct business and interact with others professionally. The dance studio deception. My daughter Emma had been taking ballet classes at Elegance Dance Academy since she was 4 years old, and over the past 8 years, we'd watched her transform from a clumsy toddler into a graceful young dancer with genuine talent and passion for the art form. The studio was run by Madame Petrova, a former professional ballerina from Russia who commanded respect with her strict but fair teaching methods and produced students who regularly won competitions and earned scholarships to prestigious dance programs. The studio occupied a beautiful converted church building with soaring ceilings, original hardwood floors that had been perfectly maintained, and tall windows that let in streams of natural light during afternoon classes. Parents could watch classes through a large observation window from a comfortable waiting area, though Madame Petrova encouraged us to drop off and pick up rather than hover, believing the students performed better without parental scrutiny. Emma was 12 when she was selected for the competition team, an honor that required additional practice hours, private coaching sessions, and a level of dedication that meant she practically lived at the studio. The competition team had their own changing room separate from the recreational students, a privilege that made them feel special and professional, with individual lockers, a private bathroom, and a lounge area where they could do homework between classes. It was another mother, Jennifer, whose daughter Sophia was Emma's best friend at the studio, who first noticed something concerning. She'd arrived early to pick up Sophia from a Saturday intensive and decided to use the parent bathroom rather than wait, but found it occupied. While looking for another option, she'd accidentally opened what she thought was a supply closet but turned out to be a small office space she'd never seen before. Inside that office, Jennifer saw multiple computer monitors displaying what appeared to be live feeds from various areas of the studio, including the competition team's changing room. She stood frozen in shock for several seconds before taking photos with her phone and quietly closing the door, her hands shaking as she processed what she'd seen. Jennifer immediately found me in the parking lot when I arrived to pick up Emma, pulling me aside with a panicked expression that made my stomach drop before she even spoke. When she showed me the photos on her phone, grainy but unmistakably showing the inside of the changing room where our daughters were currently getting dressed after class, I felt a rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. We confronted Madame Petrova together, demanding an explanation for what Jennifer had discovered. Her reaction was immediate denial, claiming she had no knowledge of any surveillance in the changing areas, that the only cameras in the studio were the visible security cameras in the main dance floors and entrance area that parents had been informed about for insurance purposes. But when we insisted on calling the police immediately, her story began to change. She admitted there might be some additional security measures she wasn't fully aware of, that the building's owner had installed various systems over the years, and that perhaps we should discuss this privately before involving law enforcement to avoid unnecessarily frightening the children. Her attempts to delay us only made us more determined, and Jennifer called 911 while I went to get Emma and Sophia out of the studio without alarming the other students still in classes. The girls were confused and upset about leaving before their rehearsal was finished, but something in our faces must have conveyed the seriousness because they didn't argue. When the police arrived, they found exactly what we feared and more than we could have imagined. There were cameras hidden throughout the competition team's changing room, tiny devices concealed in air vents, smoke detectors, and even built into what looked like decorative molding along the walls. The cameras in the changing room were positioned to capture every angle, ensuring no corner was unmonitored. But the investigation revealed the surveillance extended far beyond just the changing room. There were cameras in the studio's physical therapy room where dancers received treatment for injuries, often having to remove clothing for proper assessment and treatment. There were cameras in the costume fitting area where measurements were taken and dancers tried on various outfits for performances. Most disturbingly, there were cameras in the private coaching rooms where individual students practiced one-on-one with instructors. The technical sophistication of the setup suggested this wasn't a recent installation but something that had been built up over years. All the cameras fed into a central system in that hidden office, with recordings being stored on multiple hard drives that contained what investigators described as thousands of hours of footage dating back at least 5 years. The investigation initially focused on Madame Petrova, but as evidence was examined, a different picture emerged. The true perpetrator was her husband, Viktor Petrov, who'd always been a background presence at the studio, supposedly handling the business side while his wife focused on teaching. Parents knew him as the quiet man who processed payments and managed the facility, never directly involved with the students but always around. Victor had been using his unrestricted access to the building to install and upgrade the surveillance system over time, specifically targeting areas where young dancers would be in various states of undress or vulnerable positions. The investigation revealed he'd been selling access to these feeds through encrypted channels to pedophiles around the world, marketing them as exclusive content from an elite dance academy. The horror of realizing our daughters had been exploited in this way was indescribable. Emma had been changing in that room for months, along with dozens of other girls ranging in age from 10 to 18. They'd been recorded during costume changes, while treating injuries, during private moments when they thought they were safe among friends, all of it captured and distributed to predators we'd never be able to fully identify or locate. The studio closed immediately and permanently, with Madame Petrova claiming she'd been unaware of her husband's activities despite living and working with him for 20 years. Whether she truly didn't know or was complicit remains a matter of legal debate, but either way, her negligence in protecting the children under her care was unforgivable. Emma hasn't danced since that day, the joy and passion she'd had for ballet completely destroyed by the knowledge that her most vulnerable moments had been turned into content for pedophiles. She's been in therapy for over a year, dealing with anxiety, trust issues, and body image problems that stem from knowing strangers watched her change clothes, watched her stretch, watched her exist in what she thought was a safe space. The legal proceedings have been extensive and traumatic, with parents having to balance seeking justice with protecting our children from further exposure. Some families chose not to participate in the criminal case to avoid their daughters having to testify, while others, including us, felt it was important to ensure Victor faced consequences for his crimes. The ripple effects through our community have been devastating. The dance studio had been a central part of many families' lives, a place where friendships were formed, where children learned discipline and artistry, where parents bonded over their shared experiences. All of that was destroyed, replaced by support groups for traumatized children and parents dealing with guilt over not protecting them. I struggled daily with the guilt of having trusted that studio, of having encouraged Emma's passion for dance, of having left her in that space thinking she was safe. The what-ifs haunt me. What if I'd been more observant? What if I'd questioned the closed-door policy for certain areas? What if I'd trusted my occasional uncomfortable feeling about Victor's presence? The dental office nightmare. I'd been going to Dr. Brennan's dental practice for 15 years, following him when he moved from a large group practice to open his own smaller, more personalized clinic in a professional building downtown. He was the kind of dentist who actually made going to the dentist bearable, with a gentle approach, excellent communication about procedures, and a genuine interest in his patients' lives beyond just their teeth. His new practice was beautiful, with modern equipment, comfortable chairs that had built-in massage features, and individual TVs mounted above each station so patients could watch Netflix during procedures. He'd invested heavily in making the space feel less clinical and more spa-like, with soft lighting, calming colors, and even aromatherapy diffusers in each treatment room. The hygienists who worked there were equally professional and friendly, particularly Susan, who'd been cleaning my teeth twice a year for the past decade. She knew about my dental anxiety, my tendency to grind my teeth when stressed, and always took extra care to make sure I was comfortable during cleanings, explaining everything she was doing and checking in frequently. It was during a routine cleaning on a Tuesday afternoon when Susan noticed something unusual. She'd reclined my chair fully back for better access to my upper teeth when she paused, looking at something on the ceiling above the chair. Following her gaze, I saw what had caught her attention: a small, dark circle in the ceiling tile that looked different from the textured pattern around it. Susan's face went pale as she quickly sat me up and excused herself, saying she needed to get Dr. Brennan immediately. The concern in her voice made my heart rate spike, and when they both returned, Dr. Brennan's expression was a mix of confusion and growing alarm as Susan pointed out what she'd seen. He got a stepladder from the storage room and carefully examined the ceiling tile, his face growing increasingly grim as he confirmed what we all feared. It was definitely a camera, positioned to look directly down at the dental chair where patients would be lying with their mouths open, vulnerable and sedated for various procedures. Dr. Brennan immediately closed the practice for the day, sending home the other patients who were waiting and calling the police while Susan and I checked the other treatment rooms. What we found was horrifying in its scope. Cameras in all 6 treatment rooms, each positioned to capture patients lying in the chairs, and additional cameras in the consultation room where treatment plans were discussed and the X-ray room where patients would have to remove jewelry and sometimes outer clothing. The police arrived quickly and began a thorough investigation, bringing in technical experts who could trace where the cameras were transmitting. The cameras were all wireless, high-definition devices that had been painted to match the ceiling tiles and installed with professional precision that suggested someone with both technical expertise and regular access to the space. The investigation led to the most shocking revelation of all. The perpetrator was Dr. Brennan's own son, Tyler, who worked as the practice's IT manager, handling all the computer systems, digital records, and equipment maintenance. Tyler had been using his unlimited access to the practice and his father's complete trust to build an elaborate surveillance network over the course of 2 years. On Tyler's personal computer, investigators found thousands of hours of footage, meticulously organized by date and patient name. He'd been particularly focused on recording patients during nitrous oxide administration, when they would be in altered states of consciousness, sometimes saying or doing things they wouldn't normally do. He'd edited compilations of patients under sedation, focusing on young women and teenagers who came in for procedures. The violation felt particularly acute because dental work requires such vulnerability. Patients lie in chairs with their mouths open, unable to speak, often sedated or numbed, trusting completely in the professional care of their dental team. Tyler had turned those moments of necessary medical vulnerability into content for his own perverted entertainment, and investigators discovered for sale on various dark web platforms. Dr. Brennan was devastated by his son's betrayal, immediately cooperating with police and providing full access to patient records to help identify victims. The practice closed permanently within a week, Dr. Brennan unable to continue practicing dentistry under the weight of what had happened under his supervision, even though he'd been unaware of Tyler's actions. For those of us who'd been patients there, the impact has been profound and lasting. I haven't been able to get dental care since then, canceling multiple appointments with new dentists because the thought of lying in that vulnerable position again triggers severe panic attacks. My dental health has deteriorated as a result, with problems that could have been easily treated becoming more serious due to avoidance. The support group for affected patients meets monthly, and the stories are heartbreaking. Some people had been recorded during emergency procedures when they were in pain and distress. Others had brought their children for treatment, only to learn they too had been recorded. The elderly patients felt particularly violated, having trusted Dr. Brennan for decades only to have his son exploit that trust. Tyler was charged with multiple felonies and eventually sentenced to prison, but the damage he caused can't be undone. Hundreds of hours of footage had already been distributed online before his arrest, meaning those videos exist somewhere in perpetuity, unable to be completely removed from the internet. The financial impact has also been significant, with many patients needing extensive therapy to deal with the trauma, others facing worsening dental problems due to avoidance of treatment, and the costs of finding new dental care providers who understand the trauma and can work with severely anxious patients. The therapist's office violation. Finding the right therapist had taken me years, cycling through various professionals who didn't quite understand my complex PTSD from childhood trauma until I finally found Dr. Sarah Chin, whose approach combined traditional talk therapy with EMDR and somatic experiencing in a way that actually helped me make progress. Her office was in a small professional building, a cozy space with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with books that made it feel more like a professor's study than a clinical setting. Over 3 years of weekly sessions, Dr. Chen had become the person who knew me most intimately, who'd heard my darkest thoughts, my most shameful secrets, my deepest fears and hopes. The therapeutic relationship we built was based on absolute trust, the knowledge that everything I said in that room was confidential, that I could be completely vulnerable without fear of judgment or exposure. The office had 2 chairs facing each other where we usually sat, a small couch that I sometimes used when I needed to feel more grounded, and a soft rug where we'd occasionally do body-based exercises to help me reconnect with physical sensations after dissociative episodes. There was a white noise machine by the door to ensure privacy, and heavy curtains on the windows that created a sense of being in a protected cocoon away from the outside world. It was during a particularly intense session where we were processing a traumatic memory using EMDR that I noticed something that would shatter every bit of safety I'd built in that space. The EMDR process involves following a moving light or object with your eyes while recalling traumatic memories, and Dr. Chin used a light bar that sat on a small table between us. As I was following the lights back and forth, my gaze drifted slightly above the bar and I noticed something odd about a picture frame on the bookshelf behind Dr. Chin. The frame held her diplomas, but in the corner of the glass, there was a tiny black dot that didn't look like part of the frame or a speck of dust. but rather like something deliberately placed there. I stopped mid-session, pointing out what I'd seen, and watched Dr. Chen's face transform from professional concern to absolute horror as she stood to examine the frame more closely. When she removed it from the shelf and looked at the back, we could both clearly see a small camera that had been installed inside the frame, positioned to capture the entire seating area where all our sessions took place. Dr. Chen immediately ended our session and called the police, her hands shaking as she explained the situation. While we waited for them to arrive, she began checking other areas of the office, and we found 2 more cameras. One hidden in a wall clock that faced the couch and another in an air vent that overlooked the entire room from above. The violation I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, even worse than the original traumas that had brought me to therapy. This was the one place where I'd felt safe enough to be completely vulnerable, where I'd cried, raged, collapsed, dissociated, and slowly rebuilt myself. Every moment of that intensely private journey had potentially been watched by someone without my knowledge or consent. The police investigation revealed that the cameras were transmitting to a receiver in the building's basement utility room, where they found recording equipment and hard drives containing not just my sessions but those of all Dr. Chen's patients over the past 18 months. The perpetrator was the building's owner, Robert Hathaway, who had master keys to all offices and had been entering during off hours to install and maintain the cameras. The scope of his surveillance extended beyond just Dr. Chen's office. He'd placed cameras in 3 other therapists' offices in the building, a psychiatrist's consultation room, and even in the building's shared bathroom. The amount of deeply personal, confidential information he'd captured was staggering. People discussing suicide attempts, sexual assaults, addiction struggles, marriage problems, childhood abuse, and every other intimate human struggle that brings people to therapy. Robert had been selling access to these recordings through a subscription service he marketed to people with various fetishes about emotional vulnerability and breakdown. He'd created categories based on the type of content: crying, anger outbursts, trauma disclosure, marriage counseling, treating people's most painful moments as entertainment categories for paying perverts. The damage to Dr. Chen's patients was catastrophic. Many of us had spent years building up the courage to seek therapy, to trust another person with our deepest wounds, only to have that trust not just broken but exploited in the most violating way possible. Several patients attempted suicide after learning about the recordings, unable to cope with the knowledge that their most vulnerable moments had been turned into pornographic content. Dr. Chen closed her practice immediately, too traumatized herself to continue providing therapy when she couldn't guarantee her patients' safety. She'd been violated too, recorded during her own vulnerable moments when patients' stories affected her, when she showed emotion in response to their pain, when she thought she was in the privacy of her own office between sessions. For me, the impact has been devastating on multiple levels. Not only can I not return to therapy despite desperately needing continued treatment for my PTSD, but the violation has become a new trauma layered on top of my existing ones. The safe space where I'd been healing became the site of a new wound that feels impossible to heal because healing would require therapy, which I can no longer trust. The legal proceedings have been re-traumatizing, requiring me to describe what was discussed in those recorded sessions to establish the level of privacy violation and emotional damage. Having to reveal in court the same traumas I'd only felt safe discussing in therapy felt like being violated all over again, this time in a public forum. The other patients and I have formed a support group, but it's a complicated space because we're all too traumatized to fully trust even each other. We share the same wound but can't offer each other the professional help we need because that would require the very type of therapeutic relationship that's been poisoned for all of us. The nursing home horror. My grandmother Rose had lived at Sunset Gardens Senior Care for 3 years after her dementia progressed to the point where she needed round-the-clock care that our family couldn't provide at home. It was one of the better facilities in our area, not luxury but clean and well-staffed, with activities programs, a beautiful garden area where residents could spend time outdoors, and a reputation for compassionate care that made us feel less guilty about not being able to care for her ourselves. I visited Grandma Rose 3 times a week, usually during my lunch break since the facility was close to my office, and I'd gotten to know many of the staff members who seemed genuinely caring and attentive to the residents' needs. The memory care unit where she lived was secure but comfortable, designed to feel home-like rather than institutional, with small apartment-style rooms that families could decorate with familiar items to help residents feel more at ease. Grandma's room had her favorite recliner from home, family photos covering one wall, and the quilt her mother had made that she'd always treasured even when she couldn't remember who'd made it anymore. The staff had told us that having familiar items helped with orientation and comfort, especially during the sundowning hours when confusion and agitation typically increased. It was my cousin Maria, who worked nights as a nurse at a different facility, who first noticed something concerning during one of her visits. She'd been helping Grandma change into pajamas when she spotted what looked like a tiny camera lens in the smoke detector above the bed. Maria's facility had recently updated their legitimate monitoring systems, so she recognized the difference between standard safety equipment and hidden surveillance. When Maria called me, I immediately drove to Sunset Gardens, my mind racing with horrible possibilities. Together, we examined the device more closely and confirmed it was definitely a camera, positioned to capture the entire bed area where Grandma would be sleeping, being changed, receiving medical care, and spending most of her time due to her limited mobility. We immediately demanded to speak with the facility director, a woman named Patricia Brennan who'd always seemed professional and caring in our previous interactions. Her initial reaction was defensive disbelief, insisting that the facility's only cameras were in common areas and clearly marked as per state regulations. But when we showed her what we'd found, her demeanor shifted to genuine alarm. Patricia called the police while also initiating an internal investigation, having maintenance staff check other residents' rooms while trying not to panic families who were visiting. What they discovered was a nightmare scenario that still makes me physically ill to think about. Cameras in over 40 resident rooms, all in the memory care unit where the most vulnerable residents lived. These weren't just casual invasions of privacy but targeted exploitation of elderly people with dementia who couldn't advocate for themselves, couldn't report violations, and in many cases couldn't even understand what was happening to them. The cameras were positioned to capture beds and bathroom areas, recording residents during their most vulnerable moments of care. The police investigation revealed that the perpetrator was a certified nursing assistant named David Kraft who'd worked at the facility for 5 years and was known for being particularly good with difficult dementia patients. He'd used his access to residents' rooms and the trust of his supervisors to systematically install cameras throughout the memory care unit, specifically targeting residents who were nonverbal or whose dementia was advanced enough that they couldn't report anything suspicious. On David's home computer, investigators found thousands of hours of footage showing elderly residents in various states of undress, being bathed, changed, subjected to medical procedures, and in their confused, vulnerable states during dementia episodes. He'd been selling this content on dark web forums that specialized in elder abuse content, a market I hadn't even known existed and wish I still didn't. The footage of my grandmother was extensive and heartbreaking. This man had recorded her during her most confused moments, when she would undress inappropriately due to her dementia, when staff would have to physically assist her with toileting and bathing, when she would cry out in confusion for her long-deceased husband. Her dignity, already compromised by her disease, had been further stripped away for the entertainment of perverts who got satisfaction from watching vulnerable elderly people. The facility was shut down by state regulators within a month, with residents having to be relocated to other facilities, causing massive disruption and trauma for people with dementia who desperately needed routine and familiarity. Several residents died within weeks of the transfer, unable to adjust to new environments in their fragile states. My grandmother was moved to a facility an hour away, the only one with an available memory care bed, making it much harder for family to visit regularly. She declined rapidly after the move, no longer recognizing any of us, refusing to eat and passing away just 3 months later. I believe the disruption and trauma of the move directly contributed to her death. The guilt I carry is overwhelming and persistent. I had been responsible for choosing Sunset Gardens, for trusting them with Grandma's care, for not being observant enough to notice the cameras myself despite visiting regularly. The thought that I sat in that room with her, talking to her, holding her hand while someone was watching and recording makes me feel complicit in her violation. The legal ramifications continue, with families pursuing both criminal and civil cases. David was sentenced to prison, but it feels like hollow justice when the damage can't be undone. The elderly residents who were violated can't be made whole again. Many of them have since died, and their final years were marked by exploitation they couldn't even understand or report. The swimming school scandal. My twin daughters, Lily and Sophia, had been taking swimming lessons at AquaKids swim school since they were toddlers, progressing from parent and taught classes to competitive swim team by the time they turned 10. The facility was impressive, with an indoor heated pool, observation areas where parents could watch lessons, and a reputation for producing strong swimmers who went on to compete at high school and college levels. The owner and head coach, Michael Torres, was a former Olympic trial competitor who'd built the school's reputation on discipline, technique, and a genuine love for the sport that he transmitted to his students. Parents trusted him completely, appreciating his professional approach and the way he pushed kids to excel while still making swimming fun and building their confidence in the water. The facility had been recently renovated with new locker rooms that were modern and clean, with private changing stalls for older kids who wanted privacy, family changing rooms for parents with young children, and plenty of space so it never felt crowded even during busy class times. The pool area itself had underwater windows for technique analysis, starting blocks for competitive training, and a smaller therapy pool for beginners or rehabilitation swimming. It was another parent, Tom, whose son was on the boys' competitive team, who discovered something horrifying while helping with equipment maintenance during a weekend volunteer session. He'd been asked to check the pool's underwater viewing windows for cracks when he noticed that one window had what looked like a small camera mounted inside the frame, invisible from the pool deck but clearly visible from the underwater viewing room. Tom immediately brought this to Michael's attention, and together they discovered that all 6 underwater viewing windows had similar cameras installed, positioned to capture swimmers from below as they practiced strokes, did starts and turns, and simply moved through the water in their swimsuits. Michael's shock seemed genuine as he immediately closed the pool and called the police, but the investigation that followed revealed the horrible truth. Michael himself had installed the cameras and had been recording young swimmers for the entire 8 years the school had been operating. The underwater angles provided views that would be impossible to obtain otherwise, capturing children in swimsuits from perspectives that sexualized their bodies during innocent athletic activities. But the underwater cameras were just the beginning. Investigators found cameras throughout the facility, in the changing rooms hidden in air vents and emergency lighting, in the family changing areas where parents would help young children in and out of swimsuits, in the shower areas where swimmers would rinse off before and after pool time, and even in Michael's office where he would conduct private meetings with swimmers and parents. The scope of the recordings was staggering. Michael had 8 years of footage of hundreds of children learning to swim, competing in meets, changing clothes, showering, and simply being kids around a pool. He'd organized the footage by swimmer name, age, and what he disgustingly categorized as development stage, tracking children as they grew from toddlers to teenagers. He'd been selling this content through an elaborate network of encrypted channels, marketing it to pedophiles worldwide as exclusive swim school content, with premium prices for custom requests where he would deliberately film specific children or arrange for particular camera angles during lessons. Investigators found financial records showing he'd made over $1 million from selling videos of children who thought they were just learning to swim. The devastation to our community was absolute and immediate. Hundreds of families had trusted this man with their children, had paid him to teach them a life skill, had invited him to birthday parties and family barbecues, had written recommendation letters for his business, never knowing he was systematically exploiting every child who entered his facility. My daughters had been swimming there for 7 years, from age 3 to 10, meaning their entire childhood development had been documented for pedophiles. Every milestone, from learning to put their faces in the water to making the competitive team, had been turned into child exploitation material. The innocence of their childhood achievements was forever tainted by knowing strangers had watched them grow up through a perverted lens. Both girls immediately quit swimming, unable to get in a pool without having panic attacks about who might be watching. Lily had been considering trying for a swimming scholarship for college, but now she can't even look at water without feeling sick. Sophia used to love the beach, but now refuses to wear a swimsuit anywhere, even at home in our own backyard pool that we ended up having to fill in because seeing it triggered too much trauma. The criminal case against Michael was extensive, with federal charges added to state charges due to the interstate and international distribution of child exploitation material. He was eventually sentenced to 40 years in prison, but for many parents, no sentence would be long enough for what he'd done to our children. The civil lawsuits continue, with families seeking damages not just from Michael but from the facility's insurance companies and the property owner who should have known about the extensive camera installations. The financial compensation, if it ever comes, won't restore our children's innocence or their love of swimming. The support groups for affected families have been helpful but also heartbreaking, as we all struggle with similar feelings of guilt, rage, and helplessness. Some parents have had to deal with their children's images appearing on child exploitation sites, working with law enforcement to try to get them removed while knowing they'll never fully disappear from the internet. The impact on the children varies by age and understanding. The younger ones don't fully grasp what happened, only knowing that the pool closed and they can't swim there anymore. The older kids, particularly the teenagers, understand exactly what happened and struggle with shame, violation, and the knowledge that their childhood memories have been corrupted by someone they trusted. For our family, the ripple effects continue daily. Both girls are in therapy, trying to process the violation and rebuild their sense of safety. They've had to change schools to avoid the constant reminders and questions from classmates. Their relationship with sports and physical activity has been damaged, as they now associate athletic achievement with exploitation. The broader impact on our community has been profound as well. Other swim schools have seen enrollment drop as parents no longer trust any facility. Youth sports programs have had to implement extensive new background check procedures and surveillance policies. The innocence of childhood athletics has been lost, replaced by constant vigilance and suspicion that makes it harder for kids to just be kids.